Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here, and big thank you to the Sabah Society for hosting me this evening to talk a bit about my research that I'm doing with the British Museum into Borneo collections in Britain. As Patricia summarised very well, I'm currently working on this project at the British Museum, but I'm quite new to the British Museum. It's still quite exciting for me to be able to say that I'm from the British Museum. I started this project in January this year, and I have funding for 2 years of in-depth research into the Borneo collections, not just in the British Museum, but in other museums in the UK as well. Obviously, 2 years is not very long for such a lot of material, so hopefully we can get some more funding to extend it. But it's a start, at least in these 2 years. So I'm going to share a bit about what I'm doing, what I'm hoping to do with this project this evening, and also some information about those collections that we've got in the UK. So as Patricia mentioned, most of my experience as a historian of museums in Borneo has been in Sarawak, in Kuching. So I did my PhD dissertation on the history of the Sarawak Museum under the Brooke Rogers. And while I was there, I was very lucky, timing-wise, that I was there doing my research at the time that the Borneo Cultures Museum was under development. So they were looking for research fellows to help with research for the exhibition development, and I was lucky enough to get one of those. So I spent a bit of time in the Sarawak Museum observing that process as they were developing the new exhibitions for the BCM. And during that process, first of all, I became aware of how much material culture from Borneo is located outside of Borneo now, particularly in the UK, but all over the world. And also how difficult it was to access information about all of that material culture from within Borneo. So as part of the team, as we were working on the exhibition development, part of what we were doing was trying to find out more about as much of this material as possible. And it's not as straightforward as it might sound. So that's kind of what inspired this project that I'm doing at the moment at the British Museum. So for a bit of context of that background, while I was researching in the museum archives, I really got a sense of the museum, the Sarawak Museum, and all the other museums in this region were not just working on their own, collecting on their own. They were part of an enormous global network. So this is just one page from the Sarawak Museum's annual report from 1929, and it's just part of several pages that list all of the other museums, universities, research institutes that they were exchanging literature with. So that means their publications, their annual reports, the Sarawak Museum Journal, were being sent out to institutions all over the world. So again, this is just 2 pages, and you can see it already covers quite a huge amount of the globe. We've got India, Japan, Java, Australia, Estonia, Finland, France, Germany, Britain. So it wasn't just within the British Empire. This was a really global scientific network. And they weren't just sharing publications. This would have been the network that the curators were using to exchange knowledge, to help them identify natural history specimens, and also exchanging objects as well to help all of these institutions build their collections. So that started me looking for these collections elsewhere. In the UK, so far, I have found that there are definitely Borneo collections at all of these places. Some of them bigger than others. Some of them are a few objects. Some of them are hundreds of objects. And I'm sure there are more that I haven't found yet. But this is just to give an idea of quite how widespread material from Borneo is. And again, this is just in the UK. There are huge Borneo collections in other parts of Europe, in the US, in Australia. As you saw on that list, they were communicating, Sarawak Museum and Japan and India. So quite possibly there are things there too. I hope one day I might get to go and have a look there as well. So yeah, there is a lot of Borneo's cultural heritage. We're just talking about the cultural objects here as well. The natural history specimens, that's another story again, even more widespread, I think. So I'll start off with the question of how all these collections ended up getting dispersed all over the world and why. So to explain the why, we have to go back in time a little bit further into the sort of 17th, 18th centuries and what we would refer to as the age of imperialism in Europe. So this was the height of European exploration. Europeans were traveling all over the world, and as they did so, they tried to take control of a lot of parts of the world. And this cartoon was drawn in about 1805, and it kind of gives you an idea of how Europeans perceived their own actions at that time. So the guy on the left here is meant to represent Britain, and on the right, this is meant to be Napoleon representing France. And you can see they're just literally carving up the world as if it was a plum pudding. It's called The Plum Pudding in Danger, the name of the cartoon. So the perception really was that the European powers were literally carving up the world for their own consumption, as it were. And a lot, of course, of what motivated this was the desire for resources, things they could sell, industry, and of course, power as well. But many colonialists were also motivated in their actions by science. Science, as we know it today, was just emerging across those centuries as kind of an academic discipline. As a result of the huge shift in European scholarly thought, which we call the Enlightenment. So this would have been back in the 15th, 16th century. There was a big shift in European thought away from spiritual understandings of the world around them to more sense-based observation of the natural world, using your senses, using experimentation to try to understand how the world worked and how everything sort of fitted together. So that spirit of observation quickly grew into the desire to categorize and classify and put everything into a clear kind of classificatory grid to help understand how everything in the world fitted together and how everything worked. And of course, as Europeans traveled around the world, they wanted to try and fit all the new things that they saw and discovered into this classification as well. So to do that, the best way to do it at that time, before Google, before digital photos, or any photos for that matter, was to collect examples, specimens, objects, bring them all together so that you can compare, contrast, observe the differences. And gradually, those collections got bigger, they got amalgamated together, and they became the first public museums. So these pictures are from two museums in Britain. Oops, where did my caption go? There we go. At around the end of the 1800s. And you can see they're very much laid out to encourage comparison, observation, contrasting. So we've got all the kind of hoofed mammals put together here so you can observe the differences and the similarities between them, reptiles. And then this on the right is the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, which was a pioneering ethnographic, or what we'd call anthropological museum today. And the Pitt Rivers, it still looks pretty much like this today. It's sort of a museum within a museum now. They've kept it as a kind of historical display. But at the time, it was pioneering in the mid-19th century because it was the first museum to organize the cultural collections by object type rather than by cultural group or geographical origin. So, for example, you can see there's a case here that's all kind of ceramic pots. So you could go to this case and see, compare, contrast the same type of object from cultures all over the world. So looking at the differences, similarities. So basically, these museums were trying to be huge physical encyclopedias. So in those days, if you found something, you didn't know what it was, a seashell or something, you could look in a book, but then you'd be looking at illustrations, drawn images, or you could go to a museum where you could see real examples of hundreds of seashells to compare, contrast, trying to figure out what your specimen was. So, as I said, as people were traveling around the world, they're trying to bring more and more examples, more and more collections into one place, back to their home country for scientific research. Where are we? But it wasn't just about science that was motivating this collecting as part of the imperial expansion. It was also, of course, about power. So these are some scenes from inside the British Museum. This was before they'd separated out the natural history and the cultural collections. And as you can see, you could walk up a grand staircase and see some stuffed real giraffes just standing there inside the building. And you could see ancient Egyptian, ancient Roman, ancient Greek antiquities, statues. You can imagine if you were just an ordinary Londoner going into this building, this would be a pretty awe-inspiring, amazing experience. So it was really quite a big public statement of the power of the British Empire, that Britain was able to bring all of these amazing things from all over the world into one place and put them on public display for people to come and see. So this only fueled the demand in Britain for collections, collecting, well, and the rest of Europe, collections from all of these imperial territories around the world. And of course, it was also personally beneficial if you were someone who gave collections, objects to these museums. Obviously, usually you get your name on a label. You can impress your neighbors with your generosity and how educated you are, and also how well-traveled you are. So mutually beneficial to the people who were contributing to them as well. So moving to the more local context, in the early 1800s, or throughout the 1800s, objects and specimens from Borneo were particularly in demand in Europe, partly because Borneo was still quite inaccessible. So it wasn't, of course, until the mid-1800s that the British started settling the north of Borneo. But there were some people collecting Borneo objects earlier than that. You probably recognize this guy, Thomas Stamford Raffles. Not only did he found Singapore, but he was also a hugely prolific collector of both natural history and cultural objects. And that included a few objects from Borneo. Most of his collections were from Java and elsewhere, but there are a couple of objects in the British Museum collection still today that were collected by Raffles from Borneo. There's not much information about where he got them, how he got them, or even what they are, like this one. But they're there. There was some collecting going on early on. And moving ahead in time slightly to James Brooke, future Raja of Sarawak. He too was involved in this collecting craze when he first decided to set out to sail to Southeast Asia. Before he'd even set foot in Borneo or realized what was going to happen later. He actually wrote some letters to the Royal Geographical Society, which was then forwarded to the British Museum, and I found it in their archives, where he was offering to the people, the scientists working there, to spend his voyage collecting for them. He said he would be happy to receive instructions with respect to any special objects of inquiry, either in natural history or otherwise generally. So he was basically trying to legitimize his adventure, really, by offering to make it into a scientific expedition. He offered to collect whatever these people were interested in, and the curator of the British Museum did write a very long and detailed reply detailing many things that he was interested in. Particularly, he did include from Borneo as well, because I think the wording was because it has been so imperfectly explored, so he was really interested to see things from that part of the world. And James Brooke did indeed send natural history specimens and cultural objects back to Britain. There are a few still in the British Museum, and I think in Kew Gardens' ethnographic collection as well today. So right from the beginning of British involvement in Borneo, this collecting craze was quite a central part of what they were doing. And then fast forward to the later 1800s, we have a bit of a local museum craze as well. So colonial governments started setting up their own museums as part of this global scientific network. So we have the Raffles Museum in Singapore being one of the first in this region, followed by the Perak Museum in Taiping, and then, of course, the Sarawak Museum, first museum in Borneo, 1886. And these museums were founded with very similar sort of motivations to the ones in Europe. They were a good way for people based in the colonies to study the local environment, the local cultures, because of course knowledge is power. The more you know about the resources that you can exploit, and the more you know about the people who you are supposed to be governing, then in theory, the better you can do it. So that was one key motivation. Also, of course, they are, just like the British Museum, pretty good demonstrations of power in the local region. These grand buildings, especially the Raffles Museum is a very grand kind of classical building in the middle of this Southeast Asian colony, bringing together amazing things to be wondered at. So very similar motivations. And so, of course, now we have professional scientists, professional museum curators in the region, working in the region full-time. They're collecting busily to fill up these new museums. And they're also encouraging the government servants and the commercial Europeans who are in the region to help them and to collect as well. And many of them did get involved. As Patricia mentioned, my specialist interest is one of them. This is Charles Hose, who, as some of you certainly already know, was an extraordinary collector. He contributed a huge amount of material, both cultural and natural history, to museums all around the world. So just in Britain, that I know of so far, he contributed more than 2,000 ethnographic objects. Definitely a lot more to other museums overseas as well. And that's before you even get to the natural history specimens, which there were thousands of as well. His output was quite remarkable, even compared to all of the other people who were really involved with collecting at that time. This photo shows Hose as a very young man, just as he was on the way out to Sarawak for the first time. He actually dropped out of Cambridge University to take up a role in the Sarawak service for Raja Charles Brooke. And as soon as he arrived in 1884, he was sent immediately to the Baram, where he spent most of his career. And at that point, the Baram had literally only been ceded by the Sultan of Brunei to Raja Brooke about 2 or 3 years before. So it was very much new territory for all of the British officers who were stationed there. So he was really thrown in at the deep end to a completely unknown place for him. So the officers who were stationed in the Baram had to research, they had to observe and collect information pretty much for survival in that situation. So Hose learned local languages, he studied the natural history, the environment. He was the first person to map a lot of the Baram as well. He also was one of the first people to identify the oil deposits and to turn that into an industrial option. And he also collected, as we've heard, he collected and collected. This picture is from his autobiography, Captioned Specimens for the British Museum. So this is just one of many, many crates of objects and specimens that he sent back to the British Museum and to many other museums as well. And from my research, I think he had 3 kind of main motivations for being such a keen, enthusiastic collector. Firstly, as I mentioned, it was partly for his job, researching the natural environment through collecting, through observing, through studying the cultures, and the nature around him helped him to be a better administrator of the Baram. And as far as the Raja was concerned, he was successful in that because Hose often complained that he never got promoted, he never got moved out of the Baram, probably because he was too good at his job, so the Raja always wanted to keep him there. He was very successful, at least from the Raja's point of view. Secondly, he was collecting for money. He created quite a successful, we call a side hustle these days, in collecting. He was selling objects and natural history specimens that were very much in demand in Europe. He sent a lot through trading agents in London who sold large collections to museums, but he also collected on commission. Wealthy collectors and museums in Europe would send him lists of requests or ask him to go to certain places to collect for them. Because it was still pretty difficult for most scientists based in Europe to get to Borneo, let alone to get to the Baram. That was quite a huge undertaking. So if Hose could help them out, they were willing to pay for it. So that was another reason, the financial motivation. But thirdly, and I think most importantly, he realized that he could use collecting and his access to knowledge about Borneo to establish himself as an expert, as a scholar, so that by the time he moved back to Britain, he was able to develop a career as an academic, really. So even though he had dropped out of university, he was able to go back and spend the rest of his career in Britain as an expert in Borneo. He was lecturing, he was publishing. He was given an honorary doctorate from Cambridge University as a thank you for the huge collections that he donated to them. So he was quite strategic in the things that he donated versus the things he sold. And he was really quite skillful in the way he developed his career as a collector and a scholar. And as the resident of the Baram, he quickly rose up to be the resident from the cadet that he was, first of all. He was pretty much able to control what knowledge and what objects and information went out of the Baram to Europe. He was the one who was able to give permission for scientists to visit. When they did visit, he would take them around, show them all the things that he thought were important. So he really did a good job of sort of managing Borneo's kind of promoting Borneo's reputation overseas. So an overview again. As I said, there's about more than 2,000 objects that Hose collected in museums in the UK. The British Museum has the biggest collection, 1,400 objects, and that's about a third of the total British Museum Borneo collection, which is about 4,000 objects. So that's pretty impressive for one person. There are quite a lot in Cambridge at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at the university there as well. As I said, he donated a lot of those and he helped Alfred Haddon, who was kind of a pioneering anthropologist from Cambridge, to collect as well. I've recently discovered there's a collection in Liverpool, which I didn't know was there, which was quite exciting. The Pitt River's in Oxford, Horniman Museum, which is a small museum in London, if you're not familiar with it, and the National Museum of Scotland. And he also took hundreds of photographs, which most of the negatives are in the British Museum, but some are in some of these other institutions as well. And the majority of those collections are from Sarawak for obvious reasons, but there are quite a few from Sabah. So these are a few of the Sabahan objects from the Hose collections. They cover all sorts of object types, so musical instruments, hats. This is a plough, and textiles. That's, again, we'll talk about the documentation and how it's not 100% accurate later on. Yes, Sundatang here. That one is catalogued properly. I have some printouts of better quality versions of these photos that I will pass around later on. Beyond Hose, obviously Hose was just one collector. He was based in Sarawak, so his Sabah collections are not as extensive, but the British Museum in total has 298 objects which are documented as from Sabah. I've put question marks because I will speak, as I said, a bit more later about whether that is correct. We're not sure. But there are, so 298 documented. Of those, 266 were acquired before 1963, so during the British colonial period. And they represent at least 11 ethnic groups. Again, this is a question mark in how accurate the documentation is. And they cover all sorts of different object types, textiles, basketry, weapons, all sorts of things. And as I said, I've got some folders of the images that I will pass around at the end so you can have a look at some more pictures. There are also substantial, I'm going to change. collections from Sabah elsewhere in the UK. Again, this is not my specialist area, but so far I have identified the biggest collections in Cambridge, about 500 objects. The Pitt Rivers has quite a substantial collection as well, as does the Horniman Museum. There's a small one in Scotland. These are some objects from those collections. Again, I suspect there are probably collections elsewhere as well that I haven't identified yet. So if people are aware of any others, please do let me know.
Is this still the host collection?
No, so these are the Sabah collections generally, yes. So that brings me to my next slide. So how did all these objects from Sabah end up in the UK? So as I said, a few came through Hose, but there were some other collectors who were more focused on Sabah specifically. The collection in Cambridge and a big chunk of the British Museum collection came from this man, who you might be familiar with because he published a lot about Sabahan cultures, Ivor Evans. So he spent most of his career as the curator of the Perak Museum, but he had been in Borneo briefly at the beginning of his career, and after he retired, he went back to England, decided he couldn't be doing with staying in England, so he moved back to North Borneo for the rest of his life, spent his retirement studying, researching the cultures, also archaeology. He was a keen archaeologist as well. And actually, I'm involved with some collaborators who are working on a biography of Evans at the moment. So as an aside, they are hoping to find more information about his time in North Borneo. They've got quite a lot of information about his time in Perak, but if anyone afterwards has any specialist knowledge on Ivor Evans, I would really love to have a chat with you afterwards about that. So Evans donated, as we've seen, around 500 objects to the Cambridge Museum. Lots of those are archaeology as well, but many are ethnographic too, and he donated quite a lot to the British Museum during his life as well. Again, they cover a very wide range of different object types, from weapons to musical instruments. I find these masks quite intriguing. There's not much information in the museum records about them, just that they're made from coconut shells, and there's a couple of them. But they are quite intriguing to look at anyway. Again, I've got some printouts of these. Yes.
Right, you can show the pictures and everybody will tell it's not right.
So, second collector, of course, another one that you'll definitely be familiar with, George Cathcart-Woolley, who was contributor of the founding collection for the Sabah Museum, of course, spent his entire career here. But he also donated some objects to some museums in Britain, definitely to the Pitt Rivers, and he donated a collection which is almost entirely woven mats to the British Museum, which I think are really amazing to look at. There's a lot more than this. Again, I have lots more pictures in my folders. But this is a great example of that scientific approach to collecting that I was talking about earlier. So Woolley was obviously commissioning these in order to collect them and to send them to the museum in Britain. He was trying to create kind of a representative selection of these patterns. So
Okay.
the most interesting thing about these, though,
We'll talk about
not just looking at the pictures, I have some more interesting pictures. So the most interesting thing that really shows that he was commissioning these, he was trying to collect a representative set to send to the British Museum, is that when I went to have a look at these in the British Museum storeroom the other day, I discovered that quite a few of them have these labels on the back, which seem to be like delivery instructions to the resident interior tenom, and they have some information on the back about the patterns and things as well. So he was clearly kind of getting these sent to him from far and wide, especially to build this collection, which he has then given to the British Museum. So that's another reason I always say that going to look at the objects themselves can be just as useful as looking at the archives and the documents as a historical source, because you find all these exciting clues once you get down to looking at the objects themselves. And the final kind of case study collector, John Whitehead, who you may also have heard of because he published this book, The Exploration of Kinabalu. He called himself a traveling zoologist and explorer. First European to reach the summit of Mount Kinabalu. I think he called himself the first person, but I think he's just the first person who wrote about it publicly. And he collected many objects from Kinabalu that he also described, some of them in his book, and he donated many of them to the British Museum, including this very nice loom, which has all the accoutrements with it as well, and some samples of textiles made on the loom. It's quite a nice set. Some other collectors whose names come up a lot are Major General Sir Neil Malcolm, who was a troop commander in the Straits Settlements and then president of the North Borneo Chartered Company in the 1920s to 40s. And he contributed around 40 objects, all from Bokhara, if I'm pronouncing that right, in Sandakan, to the British Museum, including these, quite a lot of similar pots like this. There's quite a number of these. Again, I have more pictures of them, which I'll show you later. Cyril Pike, who was in the Colonial, working for the Colonial Office. He also wrote memoirs about his experiences. And then these last three names are all people who were working as professional scientists in the region. So kind of examples of this global scientific network that was working away to collect all over Southeast Asia. So Ridley was in charge of the Botanic Garden in Singapore, and he was actually the first person to work out how to cultivate rubber commercially. So he's a pretty significant figure in the history of Southeast Asia. But he was also collecting, and apparently collecting in Sabah as well, because he contributed quite a few of these brassware objects. Shelford and Bartlett were both curators of the Sarawak Museum in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So they were obviously traveling around collecting a lot in Borneo. Edward Bartlett, I know he had a big personal private collection that he took with him when he went back to Britain. I know that because he found himself bankrupt a few years after he went back, so he ended up having to sell this collection. There are lots of letters in all the museum archives in the UK of him saying he was desperate for money, please buy his collection. So his objects from Borneo pop up quite a lot in museum collections there. So yeah, a mixture of colonial officers and scientists are kind of the key players in these Sabah collections from the colonial period in the UK. So all these collectors, the decisions they made about what to collect, how to collect it, where from, where they were going to send it after they'd collected it, have really been a huge influence on how Borneo and the cultures of Borneo are understood and represented in Britain. So these were the men on the ground, and they are almost entirely men from that time period. The men on the ground in these colonial territories, they were sending these objects to Europe. The people at the museums who are receiving them didn't necessarily have much in-depth knowledge about Borneo, so they were completely reliant on the information that was given to them by these colonial donors. So the stories that these objects have been used to tell in Britain have been very much told in the voices of these colonial men. A few of them will have had research since then by researchers who've been going around looking at specific types of object or specific places, but the vast majority of them are still interpreted, documented in the same terms that they were when they arrived in the museum. And this is one of the key things that I want to start trying to figure out how to address with this current research project. As having all these stories told through colonial voices means there are a lot of potential for inaccuracies and misrepresentations that are being perpetuated in the way that Borneo's stories and cultures are depicted. And the objects themselves are not the limit to the legacy of these colonial collectors. So as we've seen, many of the collectors we've mentioned were also writing and publishing about their research and their experiences. Charles Hose, for example, going back to my specialist example, he left lots of handwritten archives in the British Museum. This is in the British Museum archive. He published many things, most famously the pagan tribes of Borneo, which is still used as a resource for people studying the history and cultures of Borneo. And he also left, as I mentioned before, many photographs, which are often used to help interpret Borneo in publications and in museum displays. So this is an example in the Pitt Rivers Museum. This is on display still. This textile was donated by Rani Margaret Brooke. But in the display, they've used photos from Hose of people weaving to demonstrate the process by which the weaving was done. But they don't really mention in the caption that the lady who's sitting at the loom is in her full ceremonial dress, which probably wouldn't have been what she was wearing when she was weaving. So there was definitely some staging going on when Hose took these pictures, which most of us, if we went and saw this, would probably realise looking at it, but the average person going to look at this museum display in Oxford probably wouldn't realise. So it might be a small thing, but it's just an example of the way that that Hose's voice comes through in the way that Borneo is understood in Britain still today. Another element is what they were writing in their publications as well. So Hose was often asked in Britain to help people to understand the diverse cultural makeup of Borneo. And so he, like many people of that time, he wanted to try and classify all the peoples of Borneo. And he came up with this very complicated classification system. This is actually from the copy of Pagan Tribes of Borneo, which is in the British Museum Library. And I actually realized when I was putting this photo into slides for a conference presentation a few months ago that there was a pencil annotation where someone's moved the Dusun into a different category. And I realized that this actually says CH. So I actually think Charles Hose, it looks like his handwriting, he went back to the British Museum at some point because the book was published in, I think, 1912. So I think he went back and he actually annotated the British Museum's copy to update his classification. So he was still working on this right up until the end of his life. Well, this is so it's titled The Peoples of Sarawak. It's in a book called The Pagan Tribes of Borneo. He mentions Netherlands, Borneo. So it's already potential for confusion about what he's talking about here. Also, the main issue with this for museums, though, is that he created his own category to fit all of the groups that he couldn't fit into the wider classification. And he called that the Klemantan. So he explains here, under this name, we group a number of tribes which, although in our opinion closely allied, are widely scattered and present considerable diversities of language and custom. So there are quite a lot of different peoples under that group. So obviously this way of classifying people has been discredited by anthropologists for many years since then, but because Hose was the one who gave all of these collections, so many thousands of objects to the museums, it's his note that went with them, and it's his classification that is still in the museum records. And when it's something like Klemantan, which could cover any one of these cultural groups, it makes things a bit complicated when you're trying to use the museum collections. Also, the spelling is different in different museum records. I think people who didn't know much about Borneo transcribing handwritten records have also got Klemantan mixed up with Kalimantan. Sometimes they put it in the geographical field when they're digitizing things instead of the cultural field. So it's just becoming a very confusing tangle of information. And as you can see, it covers hundreds of objects are affected by this. So this colonial legacy is all most British museums have to work with, really, when they're trying to understand their Borneo collections. So, for example, we get a lot of situations like this. This is from the Evans collection in the Cambridge Museum. This very nice necklace. But if we want to know what cultural group this comes from, we have a lot of question marks. And some misspelling as well. So, as Patricia mentioned, there are not many people working in museums at the moment in the UK who have much specialist knowledge about Borneo, unfortunately. So, again, they're copying handwritten records, not quite getting the spelling right when they're not familiar with local terms. So there are lots of these issues. So this is part of the Hose collection. This is not actually categorized as Sabah, it's just Borneo. So again, sometimes it's incomplete information, which means that, well, and we've got Itahamur, Iban, and then in the original register, Dusun, so. Yeah. But the problem with this is, because it's Borneo, if you search the database for Sabah, then this isn't going to come up. So, and if you search for Dusun, it might come up. So again, the documentation is imperfect. So one of the questions that I'm looking at is how we can go about making this better and making it more accessible and making the searching of it easier. And improving communication so that we can improve everyone's understanding of these objects. So this is kind of a slightly more positive example, the loom that I mentioned earlier that Whitehead collected in Kinabalu. Again, for some reason, it was classified as Idahanmur in the digital system, even though it clearly says Dusun on the object.
Idahan is a cultural term for land people. So
It's
they just pick that up and say, oh, Idahan. It's actually huge.
So here, what has happened last year, several members of the public actually contacted the British Museum through the online form, which is attached to every object in the online database, and gave us some updates, some further information to correct some of these miscategorizations and to give further information of how it was used. So this is kind of, it's a very small step, but it's a bit of hope. And I will show you later where the form is that you can go onto the British Museum catalogue. And if you have knowledge that you would like to share to help improve this situation, you can do. So this is kind of an introduction to why I am trying to do this research project and the main things that I want to ask. And this visit here and to Kuching are kind of my first steps in asking these questions about how we can start to understand these objects from a Bornean perspective rather than a colonial one, and tell their stories through Bornean voices, not just colonial British voices. How museums in Britain can make the information both more accurate and, most importantly, more accessible. These online searches, some of them are quite comprehensive, but they're very difficult to search, especially when the information is inaccurate in the first place. It's very difficult to find what you're looking for. And how can we and the museums make the better use of these Borneo collections? And I think the key thing is building relationships between museums and Borneo communities. As I've said, I am working on this project for the next 2 years, but I really hope that one of the things that I managed to do is to kind of set up a bit more of a research network, connect up the museums in Britain with communities like all of yourselves, stakeholders who have an interest in this cultural heritage in Borneo, so that we can just open some conversations. Obviously, it's a huge task to try and rectify some of these issues with the documentation and the accessibility, but I think it's really worth starting those efforts. And before I finish, just a quick example of some of the positive things that can come out of these collaborations and conversations. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Borneo Boat Lute Revival Project. So this is a group of musicians and researchers from across Borneo who have been researching boat lutes generally, trying to revive information about the making and the playing of the less well-known types of boat lute that are not seen very often these days. And as part of their project last year, they travelled to the UK, where they visited the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford and the British Museum to have a look at the boat lutes there, historic examples of these instruments that have been preserved. They were able to update some of the information about them to make it a bit more accurate. And they also gave a performance for the Sarawak Association in this old former church, which was amazing. And I was just looking at their social media this week, and I saw they've just posted that following on from that visit, they have been able to reconstruct one of the boat lutes that they saw in the British Museum, so it can now be played again. Yes, so they are looking at boat lutes across Borneo. So this is kind of an ongoing project that shows how fruitful and how interesting those relationships between the museums and the communities can become if we can start the conversations and make those connections. So you can look at their social media, they have a lot more information. You can see some videos of the boat lutes being played and so on. Oops, come on. So all of the museums that I have mentioned in detail today have some of their collections online that you can go and search. Because often when we talk about accessibility, a lot of people say, well, digitization is the answer. Put it all online, we can search. But first of all, that's a massive task. The British Museum has more than 8 million objects in its collection, so you can imagine how many man-hours that would take to digitize everything. They do have most of their Borneo stuff digitized, actually, luckily, so you can search it. The other museums have parts of their collection digitized, but they all have different online systems as well, online portals. Some of them are easier to use than others. And as we've already seen, if the information is not accurate in the database to start with, it can be very difficult to figure out how to bring up the results that you're looking for. You can miss things. Even me, who spends pretty much all day, every day looking at these things, it's quite difficult to get the right things to come up when I want them to, even though I know they're in there. So is this kind of digitization the answer? Do we need kind of a central resource for Borneo collections specifically? This is something I'm interested in hearing opinions on as well. And just finally, if you do happen to want to go and browse the British Museum collection, you can do it at this link. And if you see some objects that you think, I know better than the information on there, I know what this information is incorrect, or I know more about it, I can add information, there is this button down here called Give Feedback. And that will take you to an email submission form. And if you fill that in, it will get sent to either me or my boss. And we will be very happy to receive any information that we can then use to update that system. And obviously, the way the information is displayed is not perfect either, so it will take some time to get through all this, but hopefully we can make a start of really helping to improve communication about these collections. So, terima kasih, and if there's anything about anything that I've talked about today that you have opinions, thoughts, would like to discuss, please do come and speak to me or drop me an email. I'm very open to any discussion. Thank you very much.